Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Engage 10. It's our 10th in our series, I think since last year or even this year. And today's topic is on academic advising. Welcome to our higher education leaders here and abroad. We've got quite a few international guests here, academics, teaching and learning staff, student affairs staff, student development and support, researchers and students who are studying this domain. Welcome to everyone. A special thank you to my colleagues at Helm who are making this possible and making this run so smoothly as it does every month. So this is a fantastic topic and so relevant now as before, especially now because our colleagues across the higher education institutions in South Africa have completed a report on their academic advising experiences funded by the UCDG. And our two speakers today, Professor Francois Strydom and Gugu Tiroyabone, have guest edited an issue of the Journal of Student Affairs in Africa that was end of last year. It was issue 9.2 on all of these experiences. It's a great collection of case studies written up, beautifully written up, so it's worth your while to look at that issue, edited by Francois and Guru. So we know from international research that this is one of the most high impact practices of student success. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing you speak and share with us, Guru and Francois. And let me now introduce our two speakers for today. It's Gugu Wendy Tiroyabone. She's the Assistant Director for Advising, Access and Success in the Center for Teaching and Learning at the University of the Free State. Gugu provides leadership and management in the research, implementation and evaluation of academic advising, flexible undergraduate access pathways and recognition of prior learning. Her work includes the management of strategic relationships with national and international stakeholders involved in the advising network. Gugu is also the inaugural president of the National Academic Advising Association, ELETSA. And I also learned the other day that Gugu majored in genetics, which is of course quite unusual for our domain, Gugu. So it's lovely to hear that you come from that strand, from something quite original, quite different to the mainstream. Then we have Professor Francois Strydom. He's the Senior Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning at the University of the Free State. Did I get muted by somebody? I think our tech team pressed the wrong button. So I'm going to read again for Professor Francois Strydom. He's the Senior Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning at the Free State. He's been the project leader for SASSI since 2007. And the SASSI project, sponsored by Kresge, has been used by 20 of our public higher education institutions across Southern Africa, and has influenced national quality assurance policies, the practices, and is a key component of the Siya Phumelele project.
You're fine now, we can hear you.
Is it? Yeah, now I saw a little note going, you muted, and I wondered if it's an old one. Thanks, Francois. Many of us have used the SASSI framework. Myself, I've used it at UWC, again at Stellenbosch, and I found it extremely useful. Francois has published extensively on this topic and on various other topics. His research interests include student engagement and success, improving the quality of teaching and learning, and evidence-based change in higher education and employability. So we look forward to having both of you speak. And just a note on the flow of how the day or of the next hour and a bit goes. We will have questions and comments at the end. So please post your questions and comments as they come to you. Post them in chat and we will extract them right for the end to have a discussion with Gugu and Francois. We will also pop an evaluation and the YouTube link into the chat right at the end. And right at the end, Gugu has put together, the Free State with her leadership has put together a lovely video on reflections by students who've experienced and engaged with academic advising. And we will see that video. It's an 8-minute video right at the end. So we'll go till about 10 past or 3:15 today. Thank you. And you can spotlight our speakers. Thanks very much.
Right. Thank you very much for that introduction. As always, it's a big pleasure and a privilege to be with the HELM program. Bridget, and you and your colleagues for running such a phenomenal initiative for our system. And it's a great privilege for us to talk to you today. So myself and Gugu will take you on a journey. We view academic advising as a catalyst and a very important one in our country for student success. Next slide, Gugs. Right, so why is academic advising important? You can change the slide, thank you. So firstly, we must position this in a broader social justice imperative. Student success in the South African context, and especially the sub-Saharan context, is incredibly important. As you can see from the graphic on the right-hand side, if you look at the one in the middle in the bottom row, the return on investment of tertiary education in sub-Saharan Africa is higher than in any other country on the planet, including high-income countries. So our degrees are literally tools of greater equality. It's a way to lift for students to lift themselves and their families out of poverty, and therefore positions our universities very uniquely as potential generators or very important generators of greater equality in our country. Next slide. All right. So academic advising, to put it still in a broader international context, there's social justice imperative, but then internationally, is this something that's done, or is it just people from the Free State talking at HELM today? And it's certainly something which has a very long history in the North American context. In the United States, it's over 50 years old. You can see in that definition that it's centered around helping students with aligning the direction of their academic, social, and personal goals, and that there's different ways of being an advisor. You can counsel, discipline, coach, mentor, or even teach. UCAT in the United Kingdom, Advising and Tutorial Association, you can see there helping students to advance in their success. The Netherlands, we can see that they assist students in study-related queries. In Australia, interestingly, advising is also emerging as a professionalized service. And then on the continent, in Tanzania, is also academic advising. So certainly an international practice. Why is it absolutely vital for South African higher education? The social justice imperative is, of course, a societal imperative. But if you look at this data from a cohort study, you can see that our students take too long to progress. They take only 19% finish in 3 years, 58% in 6, and 64% in 10 years. We know from various cohort studies that our African and colored students are the most at-risk students. So if we are truly to espouse transformation, it is that we need to provide students entering higher education with a reasonable chance of success, to access powerful knowledges and enable them to participate in the economy and improve their lives and those of their family. So that's the drivers that we are looking at here. So let's share some data with you. So this is data from an academic advising module we've added to the SASSI. And it includes data from several institutions. Google will talk a little bit more about the institutions that participated at. But We asked the students a question here: how often do you talk about your career interests with the following people? And I want you to pay attention to the fact that these students speak mostly to family and other students. Now you might go, well, why is that such a big problem? Well, the challenge of that is that we know that a very large percentage, depending on the institution, but if I can give University of the Free State and more national statistics, 70 to 80% of our students are first generation students. So for them to ask their families or other students for advice is actually not an optimal scenario, since other students most probably will also be first gen. And they don't ask advisors, professional people in their field, or even career services, and even lecturers. As we know, the lecturers on the platform, we might have the best intentions and truly care about our students' success, but we can't help that a first generation student might find us as threatening because they are first in their family to be at university. Next slide. And here we can see also where we ask students where have they gotten advice regarding their academic plans. Now, the positive news here is that for first years and seniors, you can see students talk to their faculties. But again, a lot of advice from friends and family members. So that poses a very specific challenge for us to think innovatively about how do we create support networks that meet the students where they are. How can we think innovatively about positioning advising systems and drawing them to our support services, in which we invest so much money, people, and expertise. And that's part of what academic advising does. It helps to increase the efficiency of usage of support services, which universities in this country spend so much time in putting there for our students to help them succeed. With that, I'll hand over to Google.
Thank you so much, Prof. Strydom, for the opening remarks. And once again, it is an honor to be part of these conversations this afternoon. So taking back on what Prof. Strydom has introduced to us, and why from a social justice lens and a lens of really ensuring that students have equitable chances of success when they enter university, it's important for one to really understand and unpack what academic advising is. And we've seen from the definitions from across the globe that academic advising has been fashioned in different countries, in different parts of the continent, as an effort to just try and support students, where there is a combination of supporting students through mentors and peers. It is somehow a lever that enables students to succeed. So just to backtrack and look at how academic advising in South Africa has advanced, or developed rather, we can date it back to around 2006, 2007. And some of you might wonder, but I've been in the system since then, and there was no conversations of academic advising around then. Well, the first traces of academic advising in the country stem back to that time, because that is when the work of student engagement really started picking up momentum. And through the work of student engagement, it gave rise and question to the field of higher education in South Africa around high impact practices, which include academic advising and tutorial programs. So for us, in our context of the South African context, looking at academic advising and where it comes from and what informed it, we can really pin it back to student engagement being the national catalyst, giving rise to efforts towards academic advising. We then progressed to around 2010, where there were two institutions that really started looking at work of academic advising. One of the two formally joining the Global Academic Advising Association, known as NACADA, and really holding membership internationally to try and inform and understand what is meant by academic advising. Round about that time, there were conversations about what is the difference between academic advising and academic development. What is the difference between student advising and academic advising? And I think through these engagements around 2010, one could better just start understanding what academic advising really meant in our context. So from these two institutions really started wondering and reflecting on questions of, are we really killing our students with kindness? One of these institutions, the University of the Free State, looked at the credit loading of students, a very simple exercise, just looking at how many credits a student was registered for, going back to the traditional formula of 360 credits over 3 years should average a student at about 120 credits per academic year. So then looking at students that are above that threshold and really wondering what could be the challenges that are allowing these students to stay in the system so long. And through that, then it was developed and identified that institutions were perhaps killing their students with kindness and creating these flexible rules and regulations that were allowing students to take more than what was the envisaged load. The University of Pretoria looking more at a curriculum and faculty specific level, so really investigating advising through faculty student advisors. So through that, individualized support was fashioned such that it became responsive to the student needs, again being individualized support. It was then between 2010 and 2017 that there was the formation of the Siyaphumelela network, where 4 institutions really worked together to establish efforts to increase student success, also using data analytics and bringing data analytics into the conversation. And through the work of Siyaphumelela, that is where a task team was established to investigate and really look into academic advising in South Africa. And through this work, the task team established a definition, but formally then put their heads together between 7 institutions to really fashion a collaborative grant proposal where we would then advance the work of academic advising in South Africa. And through that, a submission was made to the Department of Higher Education and Training to really tap into understanding academic advising, but also expanding the reach of academic advising as a practice that enables student success. And through that work also, there was the advancement of the professionalization of academic advising. So not just looking at the practice that was student facing, but looking at the professionals that were working in this field and how they are capacitated to enhance and ensure students are effectively supported. Through this work, 7 of the institutions then fashioned the deliverables in a way that was contextual for their context and ensure that they then have a responsive way of expanding and enhancing academic advising efforts at their respective spaces. And of recent times, 2021 and 2022, there was the closeout of the first round of the collaborative grant, and we are into the second round of the collaborative grant where 14 institutions will receive funding into academic advising and enhancing academic advising professionally and the practice at their respective institutions. But the remaining 12 within the sector will then have access to the global and the national community so that academic advising is advanced across the country. So in terms of what we ended up defining academic advising as through the task team, we really started to position it and reflect that it is rather a teaching and learning process that looks at empowering the student, but also most importantly, looks at addressing and aligning success of students, looking through the lens of their personal, academic, and career goals. So no longer just fixated on getting the module marks right, but also looking at what are your aspirations as an individual? What are your capabilities? What are your abilities? What are your skills? And then what are your career aspirations? And really aligning that, having that one person that George Koo announces as the student, that the person that students look for across an institution, to just discuss and have a conversation around what is to happen. So really looking at academic advising also as an effort or a practice that maximizes the student's potential, increases and allows for a meaningful academic experience, but also has that sense of belonging established for the students that ultimately affords the students a chance to succeed. So really positioning it in South Africa as a teaching and learning practice. And this definition is adapted and adopted from global definitions and practices, but most importantly, from reflections as the South African higher education sector on where we've seen components of advising exist within this sector. So Francois earlier on shared two graphs where he shared the data from the academic advising module from the student engagement survey that was recently run. So these are further data points that students from these specific institutions reflect on and indicate is their experience of academic advising. So just looking at what the students are saying in terms of, since they've been at the institution, whether they've had an academic advising encounter, whether they know what academic advising is or not. In some instances, institutions introduce the concept of academic advising pre-registration, but some of them get introduced to it post-registration during orientation. But in this instance, the students in these institutions indicated that 68% of them had an encounter with academic advice, which is somewhat promising because somehow these students were really now being made aware of what academic advising is and what it holds as a practice for them in terms of supporting their success. And then the second question that we looked at is then, since you've been at this institution, have you had academic advising, but also looking at it as split between first years and senior student? And as you can see, about 70% of the respondents being senior students indicated that they had academic advising, while a fair amount of the first years had also encountered academic advising, which is again promising that the concept is introduced earlier on for the students, that they can then create that idea in their minds that there is that support that student engagement argues is that one point of engagement that students look forward to having, that increases their chance of engagement, but also promotes student success. And then in terms of the quality of academic advising, looking at the 68%, 32% split of students who had been through academic advising, we can see that at their respective institutions, they've indicated that they've had a good experience of academic advising. There is some space for advancement and development for us as professionals and improving our practice, because 4% of the students indicated their experience was poor, but 23% of them also indicating that their experience was fair, but a large amount of them either indicating that it was good or excellent. So rather great to see that even though in these institutions who took this module through the student engagement survey do not formally have academic advising systems taking place, but the concept and the practice was gradually or is gradually being introduced to the students. So in terms of the qualitative reflections of students and indicating why they've had academic advising, not been through academic advice, you can see here that some students just say, I guess I was just lazy. And you can just imagine, I have a picture of the student indicating, I was just lazy, I guess. Some students indicating that, some students saying, I really wasn't sure what to go and ask. So some of them really shy, and that could be those first generation students needing that support, but not really confident of what am I going to ask and how am I going to ask it. So that articulation could be something that gives them that sense of not wanting to go for academic advising. Some of them saying, one student saying, there is no particular reason for it, I choose not to. So some students, it being just a choice that they don't necessarily feel that they need academic advice. But again, looking at the reflections that Prof. Stradom shared earlier on, they could have asked their parents and their friends, so they feel they don't need to ask anyone else across the institution. Some of them saying, I tried contacting them, but they don't reply. And we know that the advisor-advisee ratio is at sometimes a questionable ratio. So sometimes advisors are inundated with these requests from students, particularly during registration. So sometimes that one encounter during registration is that experience that makes a student despondent to ever seek academic advising. So again, reflection for our practice, how do we enhance that and make sure that students don't have a bottleneck forming at the doors of academic advisors? So again, academic advisors tend to consult mostly with people who failed their modules. So again, is our predictive analytics looking at advising being exclusive for priority students or at-risk students? Or are we then communicating a message that advising is a service for all? So again, the qualitative data really giving some nice context in terms of how one can start around fashioning academic advising at your institution. I will now at this moment also then share examples of institutional approaches, because it's not a one size fit all. It's not that one institution tried out credit load and now it is the magic bullet that will solve and introduce academic advising at all our institutions. From the start of the initial academic collaborative grant cycle, we took an inventory of where are institutions and where is their need? Where do they need to plug in academic advising? Is it in the academic departments? Is it in the academic faculties? Or is it an institutional need that they need to bring in? And these are the experiences of 7 institutions or approaches of 7 institutions and how they started academic advising. I must also put it forward a disclaimer. These institutions through the collaborative grant were granted 400,000 Rand per annum over 3 years, which tallied up to 1.2 million Rand. And then they were then able to supplement those funds through institutional funding to then grow the efforts towards academic advising. So again, keep that at the back of your mind, that it is not just in some instances the 400,000 that helped them kickstart academic advising, but it gave them a start for their practice and looking at what they're doing. So looking at what the Durban University of Technology did when they started participating or have achieved through their participation in the collaborative grant, is that they then started appointing academic advisors to service all their faculties. So they centralized them, but the advisors themselves were servicing students from all faculties. Then they also looked at a middle layer, because possibly they were identifying that their students were asking their peers. So they then established what they call tutors, mentors, and advisors as a collective to then look at how does this layer offer supportive layers that then do not need to go up to the top or the most intimidating staff members, but can rather meet their peers and ask around what academic advising is, but also get accurate information around support. They also then worked on auto scholars, so really looking at analytics and how that fed into their practice of academic advising. And what auto scholar did for them is really allowed them to map their curricula better for their students, but also most importantly, track the progress of their students. So really looking at the Durban University of Technology, bringing in an element that is a frontline support for students, building in a layer of peer support, but also starting to introduce predictive analytics. What is interesting is we've learned from the Americans is they've indicated that in South Africa, bringing in the conversation of predictive analytics and data analytics into the advising work, we've leapfrogged about three decades into the work that they've done, because they took years and years to try and understand and really get to understand what matters and enable student success. But we were fortunate enough through this Yaphumelela work to bring in the analytics early enough into the advising conversations that such efforts are enabled in academic advising. Looking at what the Nelson Mandela University did or achieved through their participation of the collaborative grant is also rather interesting. They took a different turn to it. So they looked at what we've defined nationally as academic advising, and they took it into their own context to really understand, okay, so what does this mean to a Nelson Mandela University student? And they started drafting what they call the success coaching conceptual framework and policy. So they had a framework that they then looked at, and this went in line with what they were doing as an institutional realignment exercise. And through that, they embedded academic advising into their success coaching work. So really looking at marrying two practices into their work. And they have formally established what they call success coaching at their institution. What they did through the work of the collaborative grant is they then took that policy and that framework and they applied advising practices or success coaching practices to their first year students. And the results thereof yielded that in 2021, their F10 retention rate, the first time entering student retention rate, sat at 91%. And looking at the 2022 first time entering retention rate, that sits at 96%. So rather promising that having that one person that you can speak to does affect or influence the retention rates at the institution. And then further looking at the success rates of also the first time entering students, they saw that their first time entering students success rate in 2020 sat at 83%. Now, some of us might argue that it might have been COVID, but even despite there being COVID, the success coaches remained available for the students. So that was also quite an interesting effort that we saw come out of this work. And in 2021, the F10 success rate then moved to 85%. So again, looking at what international experts argue is that academic advising should enable retention, but enhance student success. So really evident from the work of Nelson Mandela University that having those people known as success coaches there for the first time entering students really does impact on the retention rate and the success rate. If you want to know more about what these institutions did in more detail, I could really connect you with the colleagues, and I think some of them are in the audience here, and they can tell you exactly what they did in the whole success coaching program or in their TMA programs that they were able to see this impact in their work. The Mangosuthu University Technology was the third university to participate in the collaborative grant. And what they did is they started looking at student academic advisors partnering with other institutional stakeholders that then enabled them to enhance student success. And this included the student counseling unit. And I know in some instances, it is a hard conversation to have around what is the difference between academic advising and student counseling. But through conversations and intentional networkings and alignment of efforts, the Mangosuthu University of Technology was able then to differentiate, but also collaborate their efforts with units such as the student counseling unit. And they were then also able to have their academic advising practice governed by their student academic mentoring and support framework. So again, looking at it, seeing academic advising in this institution becoming an institutional effort as opposed to being a faculty effort or just a departmental effort. The fourth institution in the collaborative grant was the University of Cape Town, UCT, and what they have seen or achieved through this, their participation in the collaborative grant is they have about 8 staff who have been formally accredited or certified through the Academic Advising Professional Development Short Learning Program. And towards the end of the conversation, we will share how this has enabled the sector to have more certified professionals operating in the space of academic advising. But UCT is seeing that 8 of their staff really starting to become trained and better refined towards helping students, but also having 10 peer advisors trained to support students in 2 faculty-based hubs. So again, looking at institutional efforts, but also using the layer of peer advising as a layer that enables, but also supports student success. And they also then established what they call a student help desk. And some of the colleagues might know it as the CARES, the Central Academic Advising something, but the colleagues can also indicate it in the chat. But that's their CARES line, which is the academic advising line to support students. And this came up more prominently during COVID. So also UCT having an institutional effort, but also going into the faculties to create student support hubs through the establishment of peer advising as a supportive layer. The University of the Free State, in amongst the work we've done around the collaborative grant, is we have then been able to write up a NQF level 5 short learning program. And through this, we've been able to capacitate 273 advisors across the country. And the only requirement is really a grade 12 certificate, and really just being someone that's interested in academic advising, practicing, or a postgraduate student, to really unpack and really better understand and fashion academic advising for your context. What the outcome of this short learning program is each participant walks out of the short learning program with what we call a portfolio of evidence, which they can then take and use that to establish or start up academic advising in their respective contexts. So we start from constructing a definition from advising, identifying where advising takes place in your institution, and ultimately personalizing it for oneself in terms of a definition and having then the efforts that support one. We've also then, through the work, been able to fashion or develop what we call the GPS, which is the graduation positioning support system, where we are then offering students support through telephone, where students can leave a callback message, or they can leave us a WhatsApp message, and they can engage with what we call success coaches, also a layer of peer advisors, or they can simply drop us an email. So really looking at opening multiple channels that can enhance and support student success. The University of Pretoria, on the other hand—
I didn't get that. Could
Sorry.
you try again?
Sorry, that is Siri talking to me while I'm also talking. So in terms of the work that the University of Pretoria have done, is the University of Pretoria have looked at peer advising as an extended advising strategy, so also incorporating peers. And I think this is evident from the data we've been sharing, that peers are an important layer to capacitate. The University of Pretoria capacitate peer advisors and identified them as a formalized strategy to support students. But they've also had now recently 23 faculty student advisors appointed. At some point, they only had 4 of them. And you can imagine in 3-4 years, they've really multiplied that by 12 to get, no, not even 12, by 7 to get about 23 advisors. So really looking at promising efforts and evidence in terms of what advisors have brought into their space, and looking also at their student advising appointments. We can see the growing numbers, where in 2020 they saw about 3,300 students, but in 2021 seeing almost 4,300 students through their FSAs and other layers of advising existing at their institutions. The University of the Witwatersrand, in their space, started contributing towards scholarly work around academic advising through formal publications, where they conducted or wrote up a literature review on academic advising, contextualizing it for South Africa, but also participating in national conferences, one being the South African National Resource Centre's first year experience conference that is held annually, where we started sharing, where they started then introducing conversations around academic advisors. And what they've also seen come up in their work is they enabled or bought biometric scanners to try and monitor which services students visit, and try and bring that together into the advising space, so that stronger relationships and referral systems are established between the critical stakeholders which students need to make use of. And in their space, they have approximately 18 advisors that have gone through the advising short learning program. So really seeing that efforts of professionalizing the practice, but also bringing into the space different types of practice and initiatives to try academic advising through the institution is really, really something each institution has really taken and owned for their respective contexts. So in terms of the overall lessons learned that we've taken from the first cycle of the collaborative grant, is that the involvement of diverse stakeholders does enable a network and does enable better collaboration and better visibility for students and better understanding, because through the collaboration, a student knows when to go to student counseling. When I'm having a panic attack or having an anxiety attack, do I go to my academic advisor, or do I go to student counseling or student health and counseling? that has enabled departments to differentiate the expertise, but also for students to better understand the work that is being done in each office. What we've also learned is that peer advising is a critical layer. Even in the recent student engagement survey, we're seeing that students are still asking their peers. So it is a critical layer that we need to capacitate, that they can then refer and provide accurate information to students within the institution. Another thing, the third thing we've taken from it is academic advising is most definitely positioned in the teaching and learning space. We are seeing the evolution of our academic departments, our academic centers of excellence becoming centers for teaching and learning, but nationally we're seeing it as a practice positioned within teaching and learning and an effort of collaboration. The training of advisors is something that is totally expanding. We're seeing multi-stakeholders participating in advising. We've got housing and residence affairs bringing this into their space to try and start having conversations of creating conducive academic environments in their residence spaces. So really having multi-stakeholders, being involved in this work. And lastly, that students want to be empowered to drive their own success towards achieving their academic and career goals. So through COVID, we've seen that student agency, and we need to leverage that student agency that exists as institutions so that students are supported, but also are responded to, not only just at a group level, but also in an individualized level. And on that note, I'm going to hand you over back to Francois to take you through the concluding slides.
Thank you, Gooks. All right, colleagues, so what's the call to action here? It's that we need to find ways to be proactively reaching out to our students than rather waiting for them. So you can see through the various examples that Gugu's gone through, and we've chosen those 7 institutions as sort of a bouquet of examples of how academic advising can develop in an institution. But the proactive need based on who our students are, they're first gen, the majority of them in this public system is NSFAS funded. So there's significant financial pressures, also massive academic performance pressures. Making the links between careers and what students are studying is absolutely vital. We all know that a big challenge in our context, well documented, is the differential availability of career guidance in our schooling system. And that means that many of our students enter our institutions quite literally, they'll take any spot as long as they can get into higher education, because a university degree helps me to be employed, of course, right? And only after the first year do they start asking questions about, is this really for me? So advising has a very important role, as Google defined it as a teaching and learning practice, to share information and show students the links between what they are studying, but also the overall value of a university degree to being employable, so that students don't have a unnaturally narrowed view that because I do X, I can only do a certain profession, but that a university degree gives me a set of skills. So advising needs to be more than just module or course allocation or curriculum advice, right? And then it has to be easily accessible. Gugu spoke to this in the lessons from the UCDG group. We have to think in a sophisticated way about having different levels of advising and identifying very clearly what a peer advisor can and cannot do. They are just a referral source, not a space for intervention, but a level which is not so scary. Because if I even go to an advisor who cares deeply about my success, I might feel like they're going to catch me out, like I don't know why I'm studying. And then getting students on the right path. But then, as Gugu illustrated, several institutions using analytics where advisors and institutional researchers work very closely together to keep our students on track. Because, of course, if we go back to the first slides, if I go and ask my friends after my first semester as a first year and I failed a couple of courses or modules, and I say to them, guys, I can't afford to lose my NSFAS funding. What is an easy credit? And they'll tell you, my friends will tell you this and this and this if you're doing this is an easier credit, but with no context of what the implications to overall throughput or completion might be. Next slide. The resources for advising, I saw a question in the chat. The AAPD short learning program, which Gugu and our colleagues have been running exceptionally well. We had our colleagues at Georgia State University give inputs into the development of that course. We'll have our email address, but you also see the ELETSA email address. Then there is the ELETSA website. We give you a little screenshot there. You can see what the web address is, and you can see wonderful resources there. Then, as Birgit mentioned at the beginning, the JSAA edited 9.2 volume is really a display of how we are deeply contextualizing and establishing the scholarship around advising. And then the University Advising Collaborative Grant, also run by Gugu and the team. We are really focused on trying not only to stimulate advising in the 14 institutions that are participating, but in all 26 institutions through NACADA membership that we have been able to, with the wonderful support of DHET, to secure, so that all public institutions in the country can access the wonderful resources in NACADA. And with that, that is our talking bit. Birgit, over to you.
Thank you. That was lovely. And I can see from the comments that everybody's, head is going mad with ideas and with thoughts and questions. In fact, I had to stop Francois from answering all the things online, because I said, Francois, keep the conversations for everybody to benefit afterwards. The first three that came quite early at 2:15 were questions about the difference between academic advising and academic counseling. And I'm thinking also, one extends it on the continuum around mentoring and coaching and so forth. Francois and Gugu, can you say a little bit about the difference? And then how important is that difference? How caught up should we be getting, in that difference? Where does it matter? Why does it matter?
Shall I give it to the counseling psychologist first?
Yep. Oh, do you want to give it to me?
The counseling psychologist can go first.
So, colleagues, I hope through the definitions that Gugu has given, that academic advising has a very particular academic teaching and learning focus. But of course, you can't separate academic issues from personal issues, from career issues, right? But you can very clearly, and while this questions was being asked, I went into the AAPD modules that we have, how we teach the advisors when it's time to refer. But there is an overlap in a certain sense. So setting academic goals, managing stress, which some counseling psychologists might deal with. But very, very early on, I started talking to our student counseling colleagues. And I said to, it was Refilwe at the time, who's now left the university. I said to Refilwe, these questions that students have around courses and how to study correctly and things like that. And she would look at me and she would say, Francois, we simply don't have enough people to get to that. As a counseling division, I need to prioritize students who have serious challenges. And I'm now talking on the level of suicidal ideation, gender-based violence on our campuses. And our counseling divisions are, and it depends on your institutional context, are absolutely have to prioritize emergency. So they can't, and previously before academic advising, they would just refer to the faculties. That would be the answer to me, right? And of course, people in the faculties try their best, but they're not trained on how to advise a student. So it was a gap in our system. So as Google has said several times, you have to talk to each other. You are not in competition. What a psychologist does is very, very clear and very, very different, but to an extent similar. As psychologists, we know the first indications that you are struggling, you see in academics. But if you work with academic advisors, you can triage students that are stressed about a subject to deal with a subject before the performance in a subject becomes depression and then a serious psychological issue. So it is about working together, but Google can talk. This is the question that we've literally had 273 times.
Absolutely, absolutely. But nothing beats the collaboration and the conversation. I think in some instances, and even us at the University of the Free State, we have overlaps or collaborations where we send students who are confused totally about what they want to do, and we send them for career assessment. And of course, the student counseling unit does those assessments, and the student then brings that report to an advisor that we explore conversations. So again, holding hands in the efforts that we pull in terms of, okay, you know the curricula better and you know the strategies or the pathway to get there. So continue the conversation. I've had the assessment conversation, but absolutely the psychologist and the counseling units really, really specialized efforts in their work, but nothing beats collaboration and conversation. And it does take a while. It is a process for everyone to understand.
Thank you. That's great. I want to quickly move to the next question. There were quite early on, there were comments about face-to-face or peer or online academic advising. Can you say something when the one is more important than the other? Can it be augmented, or what is your preference in terms of upscaling?
Interestingly, I'll take that one. Interestingly, is when we started advising, we were adamant that it must remain face-to-face. And for the longest of time, it was face-to-face. We had face-to-face workshops. The student had to come into my office. We had to have a conversation face-to-face. And then, surprise, surprise, everyone's biggest hurdle that we faced came COVID, but we were gradually starting to introduce online platforms. So the learning management system really being spaces where we're introducing advising, having online appointments with the students, online workshops with the students. So it really varies, but very critical that at the beginning of the year, you try and have a balance of online and face-to-face engagements with the students, because the online caters for a bigger cohort of students, but the face-to-face is more an individualized effort. In recent times, we've also seen the effectivity of something like a WhatsApp chatbot. Ourselves and the University of Cape Town are really looking and really using a lot of that. Just in last year, the University of the Free State saw over 1 million messages between success coaches or advisors and students constantly coming back with a 61% return rate. So really seeing that the multiple forms of expression of advising is critical, but throughout the year, we afford students that flexibility of either walking into our offices or then just meeting online or just attending workshops. So also, as you would have seen through the approaches of all the other institutions, the peer advisors having faculty hubs, more face-to-face approach. So it really varies, but really make space for the group interventions and the individualized interventions, and it's really flexible nowadays, so really cater for what your students prefer.
That's great. I mean, if anybody wants to just raise something, please just raise your hand if you want. Otherwise, I'm going to go through the chat. There was also a comment about monitoring and evaluation models, and I'm imagining you have got M&E, overlaid over your program, certainly at the Free State. And I know that you work very evidence-based. So you ask questions around which kind of advice in which avenue is the most effective for which kind of student, and you monitor that. Can you give advice on how important it is? It is important, but how important it is and how best to do that?
Shall I go for it? Okay, so always keep both qualitative and quantitative evidence. One of the big things that underpins academic advising is what we call the concept of academic advising, and that's really having a curricula for academic advising. So what are we trying to do through advising? Having a pedagogy for academic advising, and having learning outcomes. So like any other module, and in previous times in the advancement of academic advising, it was looked at as almost equal to teaching. An advisor is a teacher. So it is those learning outcomes that one holds on to and then asks, from advising, what do you want the student to know? What do you want them to be able to do? And what do you want them to be able to value and appreciate? And both of these, all three of these categories, if you reflect on them both qualitative and quantitatively, you can then start responding and collecting the evidence that is aligned to that. So I would definitely say start by just asking yourself, what are you trying to address through academic advising practices? Is it because your first time entering students are not staying, or their success rate is poor? So what are then the efforts that you're putting together, and how are you going to measure that? That's really, for me, the starting base. I don't know, Prof, if there's anything you want to say, but I really want to say the student learning outcomes of what advising is trying to address, and the approach through which you want to do that is very important, and collecting the data there is just critical.
I can maybe just add one thing on how important this is from a management point of view and establishing advising. In CTL, we have a saying, if you don't have data, it didn't happen. Because and why we emphasize that is we have to be accountable to our students, but also to the taxpayers on how we spend money on supporting students, especially in the UCDG, right? But what often happens is people want to know, well, now you want us to appoint advisors, higher education budgets are getting smaller and smaller. What's the value this is going to add? And that's the difficult conversations around budget. And why the data is so absolutely vital is, firstly, you can do analyses on how advising has impacted student success. And we know that just from one advising session, there's a 10% or more improvement in the probability of a student passing 70% of their modules. Because then if you start talking about subsidy, then you start saying, okay, more students passing, more students taking a full FTE loading. Then you're starting to talk not thousands, but millions of rands in subsidy income. And then advising is self-paying and income generating. So one cannot emphasize how important the data work, the tracking of what you do is right from the beginning. And in the collaborative grant, we reflect on that intentionally all the time. Because that's how you are accountable, but you also show impact and you become sustainable. So I wanted to add that perspective.
So Francois and Google, I know people ask me on the side, not in the big chat, whether you're available to advise people and can help them think it through, how one tracks and how one monitors outcomes. And I've said you would be available, so I've just kind of spoken for you. But I'm, you know, I know you are, you're very helpful. So if anybody is desperate and wants to understand, how do I track, how do I make sure that what you're saying now is, how do I translate my advising into boosting budgets in a sense, you know, that would be very useful. And I think in your JSA guest edited issue that you both guest edited, there's a lot of material there, and I recommend people look at that. Can I ask you another question? We want to go till about 5 or 7 past 3, and then we're going to run that video for 8 minutes, and we're going to close the room at 3:15. Can I ask you a question about tracking? How do you track whether a student, what the impact of advising, is it a longer term or a short term impact? How do you track that?
Quite interestingly, it's been a painful process, but really fruitful one in terms of our work. Francia spoke now about, you know, if it didn't happen and you don't have data for it, then it never happened. So what we've always just done at a rudimentary level is we started just collecting the student number of the student, who they came to see and what they came to see an advisor for. And that is basically when we started, you know, really tracking the students. And every semester we're at a point, a more sophisticated point. We're at a point on Microsoft Access at one point, but recently we've migrated to a module that IDSC offers, the Power Heater colleagues, and they call it the learner case management, and ourselves, the UFS and UP, have been using it and informed much of its design. But it really is that we have tried and negotiated and begged and pleaded with advisors to capture every moment and encounter they have within a student, whether it is a telephonic conversation or a long face-to-face appointment. But then through the capturing, we're able to track how many times a student came in for advising, the different themes they came for. And in 2015 to 2018, we actually did at the University of the Free State a longitudinal study reflecting on the students that came for advising and what the impact was versus those that never came for advising. And it's what Francia spoke about just now, that they had a higher probability of passing more than 70% of their modules. And we can share that publication. It's titled Creating Pathways, Academic Advising and Student Engagement. And through that, we were able to show that through the intentional collection of data of students, one is able to monitor the overall impact. And one can now date back to 2012 that we can look at all the students that have been through advising and really look at that. But I think a central system to collate the information is the starting point, and I don't imagine that there's any other way of tracking the impact of advising. And we all know that one can't say it is only academic advising, but one can definitely say academic advising has a contributing factor to that. I don't know if there's anything else, Prof, to add, but those were my just thoughts.
I think in terms of
sharing.
In terms of tracking, depending where you start, it's obviously going to take some time. The learner case management module is really, if you compare it to international platforms, is really competitively priced, and it's part because basically all universities in South Africa, public universities, use the Power Heater platform. So really look at that. Now the tracking journey, if you start doing the analytic work, then you start talking about analyses of course possible contribution, not really causality, because the contributors to student success is so complex. COVID really enabled us to take that to a next level at the University of the Free State, because we started leveraging the power of our learning management system data. In our case, it's Blackboard. So that helped with that. Birgit, if I'm not out of order, there's one very important question that I wanted Gugu to respond to I left it on purpose because I think it's so important, and of course it's difficult, so Google has to handle it. Okay. Nceza asked, how do you advise a student that realizes in their first year they're not in the right course? And this is a very big challenge, especially for all of us that are increasingly pressurized that our students need to finish in N or N+1. Chair, with your indulgence, could I ask Gugu to respond to that?
Right. Very interesting question. And I think for us at the UFS, we actually have a rule now that only permits a student to change once. But in many instances, it's really important in that first year to have those conversations with the first year student to understand what their career aspirations are. We have a lot of them that land up in a BSc that wanted to end up in med school. Some of them landing up in the humanities when they wanted to land up in education. And it's really about the advisor having that understanding whether a pathway eventually is there for a student. So in some instances, a student doing a Bachelor of Arts majoring English and history could end up in a pathway of education if they just reimagine what that means. So one, it is also important for us emphasize that it is also the skills and the attributes that you acquire through that degree that you can fashion absolutely into everything. I'm a typical example. I am a genetics major graduate, and here I am in the space of higher education, looking at student advising. Never did I imagine that this is a possible pathway, but because then I majored in behavioral genetics, one could really reimagine alternative pathways. So for an advisor, I think the advisor needs to be well equipped about what are the alternative pathways. And one does that through reading and just researching the pathways that exist, but also just motivating the student to reimagine, like I say, for Bachelor of Arts, History and English, in 3 years' time qualifies, they could potentially go into a PGCE and continue into teaching. So for me, it is that knowledge of the pathways from an advisor, from a career advising and academic advising lens, not just from an academic advising lens. And I think that, again, for me, brings out the difference between academic counseling versus academic advising, because an academic advisor brings in that lens of career advising and marries the two to eventually formulate or allow for the student to establish an identity that allows them into whether it is the now or a future career. And remember, we're no longer in a space of traditional careers. So I almost want to say we need to challenge ourselves that it is not that stock standard BA degree that will land you that job in that specific space. We are moving into a space of employability and entrepreneurship reimagined. And it requires of us as professionals to really also think about that. So the academic and career advising lens is critical to have those conversations.
I love that example, Google, that a BA landed you that job. I don't know in which era a BA landed you that job, but you know. So just the last question, and Francois, did you look through it, any others that you feel are very relevant? There's one more about people, when students come for one session or two sessions, but don't stay to the end. So how do you make sure that advising happens proactively, right in time, early on, and how do you deal with it? And the question is advising perhaps still very effective? Sometimes when people come for one session, it is still effective. Even in our minds, they should come for 2-3 sessions. Do you want to say a little bit about that? That was a question from Elizabeth at 3 o'clock. You can see that there.
Is that for Francois, or shall I? Well, in terms of really looking at where things are, I just want to double check, how do you deal with this challenge? So for us, we've fashioned advising that we have what we call an academic advising cycle. And through the advising cycle, we've taken the academic year and we've broken it up into the academic quarters. And through the academic quarters, we've identified what is critical for the students to really complete at that time of the year. So whether it is reflecting and preparing for their funding opportunities, to check in with NSFAS or check in with their bursars, the advising cycle really prompts students. So in some instances, we proactively send out a message to the student. We have a student magazine that we put together every quarter that collates the critical information. So one, you need to really represent the information in multiple forms so that it is made evident and explicit to the students. I know UP has what they call fly at UP, finish line is yours at UP, and that inculcates that habit of creating or having those behaviors that enable student success. So making the marketing, the materials really confrontational for the student when they walk around campus, sending them a text message to say, hey, we see you're not on track, you know, identifying those critical data points that influence a student's success, that we just at any time proactively say, get back on track, you're not on Blackboard. I mean, with WITS's biometric scanners, they can easily say, we see you haven't visited your academic advisor, make sure that you have done that. So leave it as questions, prompting questions, but always have those actionable reflective points that are catchy for the students, but also breaking it down into smaller chunks for the students so that they are attending to what matters at this point. So if it is time to prepare for exams, afford them that space or that information that just sends a link about 5 tips for the exams, the exam rules, the exam space venues, how to navigate around the exam venues, and all of those things. Providing small snippets we've seen has been effective, and we've seen that we don't necessarily have to have the students in front of us, but having materials and messages that are proactive also enables the student and indirectly lands them back in our offices eventually, because they'll remember that you once helped me. And even when we put together publications, if you've come to my office once, you will receive an email with that publication. So we're literally in your faces as students.
So it's using analytics. It's saying when a student doesn't show up in class, you have an automated message, automated or not, but you have a message saying you haven't shown up. And, and doing right in time advice, you know, as you're going to exams, and say something about exams. And sorry.
So a typical example is what we're doing right now. So we're running 2 bi-weekly, you know, a sequence of indicators and phoning the students. And the first call is to phone the student and then follow up with an email. And what we've seen is previously we were emailing the students and waiting for them to action something. And now we're phoning you, having that conversation, and then sending you communication so that there is that sense of responsibility. And we're tracking that to say, but you didn't check up with Francois as you were indicated to do so. And remember, Francois is still available, and here's how you can reach Francois.
Francois, last words from you.
Yeah, no, I think we've said a lot. I see Kanahi Naidu. Oh, sorry if I pronounced that name wrong because I'm Afrikaans, I apologize. You know, about overload. It's a massively important issue. Students overloading to hedge their bets. I rather overload myself, so if I fail something, I still keep on track and I retain NSFAS. And of course, all they do is they make absolutely sure that they will fail. So that's why the Google mentioned our starting point was credit overload analysis. You must know and see which students are more than 120 credits, or given the qualification, some of our qualifications have huge credit loads, nationally supported by professional bodies. So having that check-ins and making sure that you then reach out to those students proactively before they fail a lot of things. Yeah.
Thanks to both of you. I can see that you're both emphasizing using analytics. So use the data you have on students, respond to what is relevant to the students right in time. It's really been fantastic listening to you and hearing about the cases at other institutions. I want to just remind our participants to please look up the short learning program at the Free State about academic advising. Also, please, the Association for Academic Advising that Google is heading and developing. And I think that those are two very important spaces for us to advance that space of academic advising. Another comment, both your emails are in the chat. So if anybody wants to have conversations with you offline, please use those emails. Thank you for providing those emails. And there is an evaluation link in the chat. Please do fill it in. And the recording is going to be on our YouTube channel tomorrow morning. It'll upload overnight. And for now, if you can play that video for us, then we can hear from students what they experience or how they experience academic advising and their participation in it. We will close the session at the end of the video, but if you do have to leave beforehand, please do so. We'll see you again in a month at the next Engage. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Prof. Rancho and Birgit, colleagues.
Thank you,
The
Dorothy.
reason I got in touch with academic advisor is because I felt a lot of pressure because I was doing my first year and I was not used to online learning. And I got in touch with the academic advisor via my mentor.
Why and how I got in touch with the academic advisor is because I wasn't the best of students at school. So I just needed some way to get going with my work and getting motivation to actually do it, and the self-discipline, which is very important.
I got in touch with an academic advisor because I was having academic pressure and I needed a way to cope with it. And then I also needed information in regards to alternatives and whatnot in my course, basically just needing more information about that. Yes.
It was very nice because it helped me to adjust to be on a varsity level, not to think that I'm still in high school. It helped me a lot to find myself, to have a self-confidence that I can make it, I can improve on some of the modules that I didn't do well, and those I wasn't doing very well.
My advising experience was amazing. She is literally a person I can go to and tell her, listen, this is what happened. She's like, okay, don't worry about that. We'll work through it slowly but surely. But she's the person that goes through everything one by one and makes sure everything is okay.
My advising experience was pretty positive. They were able to pinpoint where my weaknesses were, and they gave me methods and tips on how to better manage it, my weaknesses and mitigate them.
It changed my academic experience because it made me realize that I have potential. I can still make it. It is not too late to change or to improve my academics.
Advising changed my academic experience by giving me motivation to do what I actually want to do in the end, but getting over the procrastination, which is the biggest thing, I would say, for any student.
So yeah, I would say that it had a positive impact, but I know there are some areas where I still need to improve upon, and they made me see what areas were those, so that was pretty helpful.
Advising helped me outside of my academic because it taught me a lot of self-discipline and of myself, and to always focus on things that are important first before doing what I want to do.
It did a lot because I lost self-confidence because I felt like I'm stupid, I'm a failure, I'm gonna deregister and I'm gonna quit. So I had a fear that people will laugh at me, but after the academic advisor spoke to me, I gained that self-confidence. I became myself.
Advising did help me outside of my academics because, as I said, there are some skills that I've picked up, like how to better manage my time. At least things are more organized in that way. So it did help me outside of things that are not academic related.
What makes South African students unique is just the fact that from my background, I've always been a person that goes to people and tries understanding how they are, how their culture is, what makes them different, and making them understand from my point of view as well. And just that connection that you eventually get after you start understanding people.
Our diversity in the university space and our social cohesion, because it's everybody from all these different areas of life, and everybody is living in they're living they're like in relative, like social cohesion among them. So we have that, and then we learn from each other and from other cultures, and everybody's able to integrate. And another thing that makes us unique is like our shared collective like drive to get our degrees and then like change like the situation maybe back home, because most of these students, we all come from not so good backgrounds, so we're using education as a tools to actually like empower ourselves and our families.
What motivates me to go on academic advisor regularly is that it brightens up my mood. It makes me to have a positive mindset towards my academics, and it helps me whenever I feel like I want to quit or I feel like I'm a failure.
What motivates me to go to an academic advisor is just the fact that I can go to them and ask them like anything basically about not even academics, even about life, even about doing things and getting stuff done and telling them what I've done and then giving me the motivation to continue.
What motivates me to go to an academic advisor regularly is to keep improving myself and hopefully being a more better and efficient student. So it's obviously one session won't help, so I need to like sharpen like those skills like continuously. So that's why I keep going back.
When I came at university, I was anxious. I never knew what to expect. My first semester was very rough. I never got the marks that I expected to get. My first semester test results came through and all my marks were less than 50%. By that time, I thought that university is not meant for me. But then I picked myself up and told myself that there's no road to success that is easy. So I went all out and got extra help. So I then went to the faculty advisors and the student advisors for extra support. And then I went with UMF to the supplementary exams and I passed them very well. My faculty advisors taught me how to have a proper time management, and that has worked in hand. And now I'm happy that I will excel in my modules and I will graduate on time.
When I started my university journey, I had a little bit of problems. First was transport issue. I was traveling from Hammanskraal to Hatfield because I didn't have accommodation. The second issue was the language barrier. Fortunately, I got admitted to Marula Lehae. I got into the activities that actually managed to help me improve on my language barrier as well. The university gave me the resources that I was able to make sure that I comprehend when they teach in class. My language barrier also fades away. It took a lot of hard work to get it done, but then I kept this weight from the President Nelson Mandela that it will always seem impossible up until it is done.
And intentional that empowers the students' learning and development process with the intention to explore and align their personal, academic, and career goals. As a shared responsibility between an academic advisor and the students, advising aims to maximize student potential by facilitating conceptual understanding, sharing relevant information, and developing a relationship focused on promoting academic success. The envisaged result is that students have a meaningful academic experience while in higher education and also feel the sense of belonging to the institution. Hence, our services include one-on-one consultation, academic and non-academic workshop, but that empowers the students. We as academic advisor are walking the journey with students from their inception up until their exit. Hence, we believe that sharing mankind inspires love everywhere.
That is